Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Pippa and today we're going to talk about chronic illness and friendships. This is a video I've been attempting to do for a long time. I asked for people's questions on Instagram, people sent in great ones, I accidentally deleted them all, so this is attempt 2. As with any video about chronic illness, it's really important to say at the start that I'm one individual. I definitely don't speak for everybody with similar conditions. Everybody has their own unique experiences. I acquired my chronic illness as a teenager, but I didn't get my diagnosis until I was 19 when my health really went downhill, and that happened at university. Before the time my chronic illness symptoms got a lot worse, I had an absolutely massive group of friends. In fact, it wasn't one group of friends. I did lots of different things, so I had lots of different groups of friends. There was always people around me, always had people I could go out and have a good time with, and in that sense I was very, very lucky. After my health started declining, I realised that I couldn't be for people what I was before. And it was a blessing and a curse, because at the time it meant that I did go on to lose a lot of friendships. But I've since realised that those friendships weren't really equal anyway. A lot of them did depend on me putting in the effort, and if people were only friends with me because I could be useful to them, then I'm actually glad now in hindsight that those aren't friendships that I'm still putting really valuable time and energy into. So these days I've got some really lovely friends still. I have fewer friends but much better friendships, which I think is something that happens quite naturally as you enter adulthood regardless of chronic illness. I have some really lovely online friends now who I've met through blogging and doing social media. I've got a really great group of friends from university. We're still all in touch. A lot of them live locally to me still, so that's great. And then I have my best friend Izzy, who is my person. She's my person. That's it. If you're open to the idea of soulmates and you're open to the idea of soulmates being platonic, then she is my soulmate 100%. When I was looking through the questions, I realised that it would be really valuable to have a non-disabled person's perspective on them. So I filmed a whole other video with Izzy as well, and we had a conversation with somebody on both sides of the equation, so to speak. So hopefully that's going to be the video you see after this one. Right, enough whittering on, let's do it. The first question is one that was asked to be humorous, but I do think it's quite a nice intro, and someone just put friendship. What is that? And yeah, let's acknowledge straight off the bat that when you're living with any kind of long-term illness, all of the relationships in your life have to change. Living with chronic illness comes with so many additional barriers, especially on the social side of your life. It can be a really isolated experience, and there's often, I'm finding this more and more, there's often no ideal solution for the various problems that crop up as somebody is trying to navigate chronic illness and independent living or adulting. Okay, somebody said, I moved to Newcastle 3 years ago and I'm still to make friends. And funnily enough, I did a stint in Newcastle myself back in the day. I lived there for about 10 weeks, and the reason I say that is because I remember feeling that same sense of isolation. Like, moving somewhere new is going to be difficult, especially if you have trouble regularly leaving the house, because you're naturally going to meet fewer people. Often it's the case that things take time, but like this person said, if it's been through 3 years and you're still not having any luck, this isn't a substitute for friendships, but I do think it can be valuable to look into what support groups might be available. And I totally get that support groups are a very different thing to meaningful friendships, because they do hinge on illness, and you don't want every single one of your relationships to hinge entirely on illness, because we have enough of that day to day. But sometimes finding the support groups is a good way to meet new people and to make that introduction, and it could well be that those things then blossom into friendships that span far beyond like the support group narrative as well. And again, that's actually what I did in Newcastle. I moved up, I was there for an internship, and I didn't know anybody, and I reached out to a local chronic illness support group. I went, I had a nice drink with them, and this was years and years ago, and I'm still in touch with some of the people who I met there. So if you haven't considered it already, it might be worth a try. Ways to make friends when you're house or bed bound. I should disclose at the start here that I have never been fully housebound or bedbound, so please take this with a pinch of salt, because I will never truly be able to relate to that experience. If you're unable to regularly leave the house, I truly think one of the most beautiful ways to make friends when you have a chronic illness is to utilise social media. And I get that that can sound really, really scary at the start, but trust me, once you start doing it, it might come a lot more easier than you might think. And it doesn't always have to be that you have to share your own experiences or create your own content. You don't necessarily have to do that. I, in the early days, found it really comforting simply to follow people who had similar experiences as mine and read about them. And if you're doing that, sometimes it can just be a case of just like leaving a nice little comment, maybe sending somebody a message. And if you're struggling to meet people to start with, it can be useful to figure out the best hashtags to look for posts under. So, not everybody relates to the Spoonie narrative, but hashtag Spoonie is a great way to find people, hashtag chronic illness. There might be ones that are specific for your condition. So if you also have ME, there is a hashtag called people with ME, PWME, which stands for people with ME. So disability, chronic illness, social media is one thing, and there's a really brilliant online community. But you can also sort of initiate friendships online that don't hinge on chronic illness. So it might be a good idea to consider your wider interests as well, and then see if there are any kind of online groups or online initiatives that focus on that particular interest. I'm trying to think of an example, like reading is the one that comes to mind because there are a lot of great reading groups and like book connectors and stuff like that, where you can join in with book discussions online, you can chat about recommendations with people. And the beauty about that is that forming those relationships doesn't hinge on the ability to leave the house. It's something you can do on your own, in your own terms, and I do think that when things are online in this way, it can be easier to tailor them for your specific needs as well. And the next question is a nice follow-on. It says, you've said before you found great friends online, just wondering how you did that. Yeah, it is something I talk about a lot because finding the chronic illness online community changed my life. It's not just that seeing other people helped to normalise this experience for me, but connecting with people over time has really brought some truly brilliant people into my life. And some of my closest friends now are people who I initially met through the online community. All of that said, I think I should emphasise that you don't want to force it. And just because you have a similar condition to somebody doesn't mean that you're automatically going to bond. It's just like any situation in real life where you're not automatically going to connect with every single person you meet. And I do think exactly the same applies to chronic illness online communities. I think it can sometimes take a little bit of time to really find your people. So I'd say a big part of it is having patience and not forcing it and not trying to push it. I think pay attention to the people you're naturally drawn towards, the people whose stuff you read, and even if it doesn't always resonate, think about the way they communicate their ideas. I think that can give you quite a good insight into who they are as a person, and that's something I really hope comes through in my own stuff that I share. And then as well, it might be that you start off in the chronic illness community, but I feel like the people who I have the most meaningful relationships with now, who I met through chronic illness online shenanigans, are the people who I had wider shared interests with as well. So there are people who used to be dancers or who love theatre, which is always a good thing to talk about. There are bloggers. I really love the online blogging community. That's a really great supportive one. There are a group of us who are disabled freelancers. We have a fantastic group chat. And all of those things are great because you know that you can relate to somebody on some level, but your relationship doesn't just hinge on that shared illness experience, it's broader as well. The next few questions are sort of around disclosing and discussing your health. And the first one is, how soon should you tell your friends about your chronic illness? I think the first factor that comes into play here is how visible or less visible your chronic illness is. So if you have a more visible condition, it might be that the best way to form a rapport with someone and diffuse any awkwardness is to just be upfront about it as early as possible. But in the same breath, you are never obliged to disclose your health condition to anybody. And if you have a less visible disability and someone might not know before they meet you, it can feel really difficult to figure out how and where to have that conversation. It might be that you don't feel it's necessary to have it if your chronic illness is more towards the mild scale, the mild end of the scale. But if it's more severe, it can be really valuable to have that chat and just let people know about this big thing that really impacts the way you live your life. It's one of those questions where I don't think there's a single right answer, but something that seems to work well for me, and I'm thinking actually this comes into play more with dating than it does with friendship, because that's a whole other thing, disclosing your disability when you're dating. Need a whole other video for that one. But I think the most effective thing to do is to see where it naturally comes up in conversation. A lot of the friends I meet now already have some idea of my situation because I talk about it online, and that's a big part of what I do. But if you haven't disclosed it, I think just go with the conversation how you normally would. And if something comes up where you think, I can't really answer that or talk about that without mentioning my condition, if it feels comfortable and safe for you to do so, I think that can be a really nice way of just like casually dropping it in. It doesn't have to be a really scary, like, I've got something to tell you, it's really serious. It doesn't have to be like that. It's difficult to think of examples. I think a big one for me has been the whole, so what do you do for work then? And depending on who the person is, I generally say I work in the charity sector, I'm a freelance writer, I do social media, and I tell them a bit about the charities I work for, which are mostly chronic illness charities. And then it inevitably comes up like, oh, that's so cool, how did you get into that? And from there, I'm usually quite comfortable saying, oh, well, I have a chronic illness myself, so it's an area I know quite well, and this is how it happened. Again, the big thing there is that not everybody with a chronic illness has a job, and that in itself is a conversation that can often be quite uncomfortable for people. I suppose if there's just something that comes up in the way that you live your life that perhaps might be slightly different to them, just see where it feels most natural to introduce it into the conversation. And I think the other big thing, again, it's totally up to you, but whenever that happens, I always portray it as in a quite positive and light-hearted way. And I don't know why, and I don't think everybody will necessarily agree with that, but if somebody's new, I try and communicate, like, this is my situation, but I usually end up laughing at it, which is kind of how I live my life with chronic illness everywhere anyway. I think having that light-hearted or humorous approach is good, especially if you're worried that it's going to scare people away, because it kind of warmly invites them into that conversation. And if this friendship develops, you're going to have plenty of opportunities later on to talk about the more difficult parts of it as well. How much to share about your health when making new friends? Straightforward answer is, it's totally up to you. Perhaps it's a case of making a judgment call on how you perceive that particular friendship and the kind of vibe you're getting from the person. I mentioned this in my video with Izzy, but somebody recently introduced me to a term called deep friendship. So like, you have deep friendships, which are your more meaningful ones where you have bonds with people, and then you also have more surface level friendships where they kind of hinge on having fun together and doing good things. And obviously both are really important and there's values to both. But if you're getting the vibe that this is a deeper friendship, or you'd like it to be a deeper friendship, I'd say don't be afraid to tell them in depth about your situation, because often it's the case that by sharing something vulnerable like that, it might be that the other person, even if they're non-disabled, has vulnerable stuff that they want to share with you as well. And stuff like that can be the very thing that facilitates a really great and meaningful and fulfilling friendship. So that, I think, is important to acknowledge. But then on the flip side, if you do see it as a more surface level friendship, or perhaps you want a more surface level friendship, it might be more comfortable to just focus on the practical side of it. So to say, let's do this, but to do this, these are the adjustments I need. So I think just judge it on a case-by-case basis. This next question is a really difficult one, and it says, how do you get people to understand I've had a lot of people leave me because of it, meaning chronic illness? It's really, really sad, and it makes me sad that it's not uncommon, because the unfortunate reality is that chronic illness is still widely misunderstood in the world we live in. There's only so much you can do in that situation, and I think one of the really big shifts for me that happened a few years into chronic illness is realising that no matter how much you share, people are never really going to fully understand. And that might seem a bit counterintuitive, because that was quite an isolating realisation to have. But for me, once I'd kind of got that straight in my head, and I realised that no matter how much I try, the only people who are ever going to truly understand are others with the condition, and myself, the only person who can truly understand your own unique lived experiences is you. Just accepting that and just coming to terms with that and finding peace with that has meant that I can move forward and indulge in other friendships, even if that understanding isn't there on both sides. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it's realising that friendships, even where there isn't that same understanding and shared experience, there's still a lot of positives they can bring into your life. So it's worth questioning, if you feel able, whether you need somebody to truly understand and to truly get your situation in order to have a meaningful friendship with them. And if that's the case for you, then fine. And it might also be the case, actually, now I think about it, where if you're friends with somebody over a longer period of time, it might be that as you spend more and more time together, that understanding continues to increase and improve. And that is something that I've personally found, and that's something actually that me and Izzy talk about in the other video. Oh, I also wrote down there's a really good resource. It's not going to fully address the question, but people might find it helpful. There's a lovely little organisation called the Luna Project, and they have an initiative called From Me and My Friends to You and Yours. And they're kind of online guides that they've created, written by people with specific conditions. And they share information about that condition in a more sort of colloquial, digestible way. So it's written with non-disabled people in mind, and there's a little section called What Friends Can Do to Help. So sometimes if you do want people to understand more about the basics of your condition, having a really lovely resource like that can be a little less intimidating than sending like a very clinical NHS page. Yeah, I'll link them below in case you want to have a little look. The next question is another difficult one that kind of ties into the above, and it's simply dealing with loneliness. Personally, I don't think there is any single solution to that feeling of loneliness and isolation, but I think there are things you can do to try and help yourself better deal with it in the moment. One of the things that has followed me throughout my whole time with chronic illness is FOMO, and something I really remember vividly is being at university when my health was arguably at its worst, and all of my friends would go out and I would be left by myself, not because I wasn't invited, but because I wasn't well enough to join in. And those were the most difficult times. After a bit of experience with that, I realised that if I was going to be all right with this, I had to be a bit more proactive in finding ways to make the situation okay for myself. And for me, that meant always making sure I had something nice to look forward to. It might be that thing is future plans in the diary, so I know that I'm going to be included next time. Or it might even be that in those moments, those evenings where you're in alone, just saving an episode of your favourite comfort show, or just having something nice to eat, or maybe like a fresh pair of pyjamas that makes you feel happy. Just having measures like that in place can be one of the ways of making quite a horrible situation a lot more nicer, and maybe even sometimes turning it into a positive thing. In the same breath, I am an introvert. I'm getting more introverted as I get older, so I am quite comfortable in my own company to start with, and again, that isn't something that comes easily to everybody. So I think if you can, it's good to find ways of spending time with yourself and being okay with that, but I appreciate that that isn't the most fulfilling or rewarding thing for people who are more extroverted. I think as well, just before we move on, I think it's really important to acknowledge that your feelings of loneliness are valid. Chronic illness is such an isolating thing. And I do remember thinking that by feeling lonely, that perhaps I was failing in some way, that I wasn't doing enough to help myself, or that I should be grateful that things weren't worse, and all these kind of things like that. But the fact of the matter is, loneliness is a byproduct of living with a chronic illness in an ableist world. I don't think anybody could experience something life-altering like this and not feel lonely at times. I know it can often feel like you have to squash down difficult feelings like that, because again, it can be difficult for others to understand, but please don't feel like you can't talk about it. Even just acknowledge to yourself that this is the way you're feeling. I think what I'm trying to say is it's okay to show compassion to yourself. I would actively encourage you to show compassion to yourself. Okay, now we're going to talk about spending time together. What sort of activities do you do with your friends, low energy ones? Again, just want to emphasise this is going to be completely subjective because everybody's at a different level with chronic illness. Like, the first thing I wrote down is like watching series together on Netflix. But in doing that, it's important to acknowledge that for some people with more severe illnesses, you can only do even that in smaller chunks and you have to pace stuff like that. So I'm going to talk from my perspective, but not everybody is going to be able to relate to this one necessarily, but I still hope it's helpful. I am perfectly happy just watching something good on TV with friends. It might be that you have, like I said, a favourite series. There might be something good on that's on at the minute. Like last night, I'm filming this long before you'll see it probably, but last night my best friend Izzy was here. We did go out earlier in the day and I was just as happy to sit at home and watch I'm a Celebrity with her, and she was happy with that as well. And like we've talked about this, it doesn't feel like a compromise on her part because it is something that we both enjoy and we still have a lot of fun doing. You might want to watch a film together. I wrote down actually my lovely friend Anna, who runs the tea party for ME, she sometimes does film viewing party sort of things where people can join in from home and you all start the film at the same time and you can chat about it, and it's like you're having that shared experience even if you're completely alone in that moment, and there's still that sense of community, and I think that's a really lovely thing to do. I'll link her account down below and you can keep tabs on what she's doing at the minute. Something really lovely that I did earlier this year with another friend who's chronically ill is, I think the proper name for it is buddy reading, but essentially we both decided on a book we both wanted to read and we read it at the same time and we chatted about it. We did that over text, but you could do that in person as well. You could meet up and discuss it if that's something you're able to do. And then in more recent years, as my health has improved, I am very fortunate in that I get to go out more and I get to engage with the wider world again. So one of my favourite things to do is go out for breakfast or brunch with friends, and it's lovely because although it might take a little bit of effort to be there, and there's obviously the sensory exertion of being around other people, once you're sat down, you know you're sat down. Similarly, I've found, and this quite surprised me, I've found that I can be quite happy and settled even in like a pub or a restaurant these days. As long as you're seated and as long as you're with people you feel comfortable with, that doesn't have to require as much energy as you might think. And something that absolutely blew my mind recently, earlier this year, is I went out with a friend and she also has a chronic illness, and we went into a restaurant and it was absolutely fine, but she just said to the person who came to take our order, she said, "Would you mind turning the music down a little bit?" And they were like, "Yeah, that's fine." And that, just something simple like that, I would never have thought to do or never would have had the guts to do. But just being able to make little tweaks like that really made a difference to the amount of energy expenditure and the payback that I experienced later. So if you are well enough to go out or you're considering going out, I think it's worth saying that it's okay to make any sort of tweaks or adjustments and consider how you can make that experience more accessible for you. This is a great question. How do you manage their expectations based on what you could previously manage? That's really, really difficult. And I think the only thing you can do is to emphasize the fluctuating nature of your condition, if that's the case, obviously, like explaining that because you can do something on one day doesn't necessarily mean you can do the same thing another day, especially not the day after because you might be dealing with post-exertional malaise. If it's something you're actively worrying about, it might be helpful if you're the one who plans how you're going to spend your time together. And I appreciate that that requires extra admin and extra energy expenditure in that first instance, but if you're the one who's planning, you're the one who sets the precedence for how much you do that day and how you do it. And just on the off chance there are any non-disabled friends watching this who want to pick up tips for being a better friend to somebody who does have a chronic illness, I think it's perfectly okay to ask your person what kind of day they're having. Like, just so you can get a better understanding of what they're capable of on that day. I'd say for the most part, don't be afraid to ask that question, because if that person is anything like me, they will appreciate the fact that you even asked and kind of brought that conversation to the forefront. I'm struggling so much to keep up with my friends. I used to walk miles and can't anymore. I think one of the reasons that chronic illness can feel so isolating is that you have to replace so many of your hobbies and your interests and the stuff that made up the thing of who you are. Stuff that made up the thing of who you are. What does that even mean? I think what I'm trying to say is that when you've done things in a very set way and you know what your interests are, feeling that change and that lack of that can lead to really strong feelings of isolation, and that's definitely something I can relate to. I grew up dancing, and although the lack of dancing is the thing that affected me most profoundly, I did feel the lack of the dance community and dance friends and having like fun rehearsals together. That was a really difficult thing to come to terms with. Something that might be helpful if you feel able is to consider how you might adapt the plans you used to do and do them in a way that works better for you. So the example here is walking for miles, and if walking is your hobby, obviously there's only so much you can do with that. But if your friends are still wanting to go on long walks and hikes, if you watch my vlogs, you might have seen that I recently discovered trampers, and they are a type of mobility aid that's like an off-road wheelchair. Using stuff like that has actually been quite an emotional experience for me, because it enabled me to just walk along my friends at the same pace and to have that shared experience in a way that obviously takes away the physical need to walk for long periods that's going to make somebody unwell. Again, in the same breath, I know that even driving a tramper isn't going to be accessible for people, and it might be that leaving the house at all isn't an option for you at the moment. I think just consider any ways where you can still capture the essence of that thing you loved, but maybe do it in a way that is more suitable for you. Now, obviously, that doesn't remove the issue that your friends are doing this one thing and you can't join in with that. And sometimes, again, the only way to combat that is for you to take it upon yourself to make the plans. And I get that that can feel really, really scary, especially at the beginning, but I do think it's one of the best surefire ways to make sure that you're going to be included in future time together. So it might be that you have to miss out on this particular thing and you have to say, I'm really sorry, this isn't possible for me at this time. Have a great time. When you're back, maybe we could do this instead. And more often than not, you'll find that people will say, yeah, that sounds good. And they'll be glad that you've suggested something where they can include you too. If they're real friends, that is generally what happens. This is a question I didn't know whether to answer, and I don't know whether I'll put it in because it hits a bit close to home. And it says, how to cope with amazing friends, but who think holistic and herbal remedies would help. This is something I've experienced, and it happened quite early on. And I'm not going to go into too much depth about it because I need boundaries. It's too much. I don't want to be too open about what it was. But when it happened, it really, really hurt me for a really long time. I get that on the non-disabled friends part, it can be really hard to watch somebody you love struggling, and you will feel like you want to do something to help. You want to take away their pain. One of the more immediate things that might come to mind is they might try and think how they can help get rid of the illness. The chances are that a non-disabled person isn't going to be able to rid a chronically ill person of their condition, and unsolicited advice isn't the best way to be an ally. There are so many better things you can do than try and offer advice from a medical perspective. Unless somebody has actually asked for your advice or asked for your thoughts, or if you have any recommendations, I would honestly say it's better to just avoid that altogether. It's funny because this happened years ago and I can still remember how it made me feel, and I'm not endorsing this, but for me that was one of the reasons why I decided that that was one of the friendships I wasn't going to put energy into anymore, because the way it was done really hurt me. And I do think when you have limited time and energy, sometimes you do have to make a judgment call like that. If, however, this friendship is deep and it's important to you, like this person said, how to cope with amazing friends. So if that friendship is really valuable and it is a longer term friendship, I think as uncomfortable as it can be, sometimes it's important just to have the conversation, to nip it in the bud and to make sure it doesn't happen again. As for having that conversation, I don't think it's something I could actually advise on because, like I said, I avoided it, which, whether rightly or wrongly, I think has served me in the long run, but it means that I don't really have the best advice for how to initiate that conversation. I think there are nice ways of doing it if you feel that's the most suitable. I think you don't have to be like, don't do that, I don't know why I did that. It might just be a case of saying, I really appreciate that you're trying to help me. It means a lot that you went away and looked into these things, but actually I'm not really looking for medical advice on that, and I'd rather we just figured out how we can spend our time together and enjoy our time together. So if you want to support me, you could do this, this and this instead. So I think communicating it in a way that shows gratitude that they care, but also clearly sets the boundary that this isn't the way to show that you care. Maybe that's the way in. And if anybody has experienced that, I'd really love if you feel comfortable, if you shared your experiences or if you had any tips on that, because I feel like that would be helpful for others to read as well. How do you hold on to friendships? My wife has chronic illness and struggles to keep them due to it. I think what it boils down to with this one is that you need to find ways of showing people that you care and showing that you're invested, but do that in a way that's not going to be of detriment to your own health. So it's like thinking about how you can put the work in, but it might look slightly different, and for them to realise that you are putting the work in and that you do care, and that being the thing that enables you to have those deeper connections and that longer term friendship. And again, this can be one of the really frustrating things, because when you have a chronic illness, it can be difficult. It can be more difficult to show people that you do care and that you do want to spend time with them, and often it's not that you don't want to go out, it's that you can't go out. Sometimes it's the smaller gestures that can make all the difference. So maybe if the non-disabled friend is having a rough time, maybe all you want to do is go and sit with them and have a cup of tea and talk. But if you can't do that, maybe it's sending them some flowers with a nice note, even sending them a text to let you know you're thinking of them. It's all about figuring out how you can still communicate those things in a way that works for you. And again, that's really going to vary depending on what your access needs are and what your illness experience is like. But I think this is actually something that me and Izzy talk about, so I'm going to leave the bulk of that in the other video, and hopefully that will be helpful. Yeah, I think we'll leave that there today. Like many things, chronic illness and friendship can be really difficult to navigate. There is no single right way of doing it, so I think it's all about listening to your gut, figuring out how you can do what you want in a way that works for you. And I think one of the positives about chronic illness is that it does make you treasure the people in your life a lot more. It can put people's love and commitment for you to the test, something like chronic illness. And if nothing else, I do think you feel gratitude for those people like you haven't done before. But yes, I think the last thing I want to say is that even if you're living with an energy limiting condition, you are just as worthy and deserving of friendships and meaningful relationships as anybody else. Actually, something I didn't talk about is something that I did at uni that was very problematic, and I will mention it here. So at the time when my health was declining and I was having to miss out on more and more, I found that really difficult. The FOMO was really overwhelming, and there was a time where I thought it's going to be easier and less painful for me to draw back and to isolate myself than to just feel continually pushed out. And it was nothing that my uni friends were doing wrong, but at that time I thought, I'm going to take myself out of this because it's going to be less painful if I did it to myself than feel like I've been excluded by people who I really care about. And again, I bet I'm not alone, but I would not encourage you to do that. I think even when it's difficult and even when you're dealing with difficult emotions, I think it's important to hang on to the friendships that are important to you. I think I'm starting to repeat myself now, so let's leave it there. I hope this has been helpful. I hope there's something you can take away from it. Thank you so much for watching and just for being here, because I know that even watching videos can take your valuable time and energy, so I'm really grateful for it. You can subscribe if you want, and I'll see you next time.